Pues vamos a terminar el tema.
Now we will wrap up the topic of labor with a digression on the Industrial Revolution.
Es importante porque una de las
This is important because one of the tired mantras that is often repeated
me acuerdo que es lo que estudié hasta
in school textbooks, it was in mine, in the specialized press, in the popular
se ha
press,
filtrado a través de la literatura.
and in literature, novels, works of art, etc. The novels of Charles Dickens are a typical example,
Por ejemplo,
is the following.
evidente que la revolución industrial
The Industrial Revolution brought widespread impoverishment to workers,
y que solo gracias
and only through state intervention and the modern labor movement did workers begin to experience an increase in their living standard.
un crecimiento en su nivel de vida. He puesto tres
I have listed 3 readings, which are the key revisionist articles on the topic,
temas, empezando por el artículo de
starting with William Hutt's article titled The Factory System of the Early 19th Century.
19, que como ustedes han podido
As you will have noticed when you read it, Hutt systematically demonstrates, using empirical data, that the notion that the Industrial Revolution impoverished the working class is completely false.
puso un empobrecimiento para la clase trabajadora.
Quite the opposite is true.
Todas las estadísticas
All of the statistics and the most rigorous analyses reveal that throughout the entire duration of the Industrial Revolution, a continual improvement in workers' standard of living took place, a continual improvement in per capita income, as well as in all of the qualitative aspects of economic development.
acompañan al desarrollo económico. Por tanto, que fue un periodo de
Therefore, it was a period of continuous economic development which benefited mainly the previously less
al
well-off.
menos pudientes. La
The
supuesta
supposed physical deterioration of workers is a myth.
es un mito, no un-
Such deterioration did not occur, and instead there was a very significant improvement with respect to workers' prior circumstances.
en la imagen de los
The
niños.
tragic image we all have in our minds of children working in the factories and the mines in conditions that are absolutely atrocious from a human, moral standpoint does not correspond to reality either.
Como se demuestra en el artículo
As William Hutt shows in his article, the reality was just the opposite. So the question we must ask is, why has a notion contrary to the factual reality of what actually happened persisted? And for such a long time, almost a century, or a century and a half? Well, Hutt concludes, though he does not go into detail in his article, that it was basically due to political and ideological factors. And to study in greater depth the reasons behind these political and ideological factors, we turn to the second article, titled History and Politics, and written by Hayek, who received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1974. Hayek starts by verifying the existence of this myth. The myth consists of the idea that workers' circumstances worsened during the Industrial Revolution, when the historical reality was just the opposite. According to statistical data, the situation of workers never ceased to improve in all the years of the industrial development period, beginning in the first third of the 19th century.
Solo el hecho
The mere fact that such a fast-growing population could be provided for was an extraordinary success of the fledgling capitalist system, which emerged with the Industrial
de la
Revolution.
revolución industrial. Entonces se plantea
Hayek then sets about explaining what is behind this myth, and he analyzes a series of causes, specifically 3. First, an effect that is almost psychological and
un
cultural.
aumento del desarrollo económico,
For when there is an increase in economic development
se extiende y se
and a
expande
rise in wealth, which to a greater or a lesser extent spreads to
en
everyone,
paralelo un
then
aumento
there is a parallel increase, pari passu, in the awareness of poverty itself.
cada vez que nos
In other
enriquecemos.
words, the more we prosper, the more shocked and saddened we are by the poverty we see around us.
Que vemos a nuestro alrededor. Sin embargo, como científicos,
However, as scientists, we must compare each historical period with the circumstances that preceded it,
situaciones anteriores a ese momento histórico, no
rather
juzgan
than judge it based on our current or modern perspective. Since from our current or modern perspective, every situation marginally poorer than our own invariably draws our attention and shocks us. It somehow makes our consciences much more sensitive.
es estudiar cuál era la situación
What we must do is consider the circumstances of workers prior to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, And when we do that, we find truly dreadful circumstances.
Pavorosas.
Dear students, before the Industrial Revolution, before the emergence of modern capitalism, the situation of workers was absolutely horrible.
Horrible. A pesar
Despite the idyllic image,
idílica de la
peddled
etapa
to us by the most varied means, of the stage prior to the Industrial Revolution, for example, I remember the famous TV series Little House on the Prairie. Well, those of us with a grey hair or two will remember that Little House on the Prairie always presented an idyllic view of what country life was like. Country life was portrayed as marvellous, a charming house on a hill, in a prairie full of poppies and other flowers, with a happy family, the father, the mother, everyone in lovely clothes, the happy girls running through the meadow in embroidered dresses. Everything was wonderful, green, pristine. The sky was blue, the sun was shining, and in startling contrast to that idyllic image of what country life was like, we are presented with an image of factory life. We are shown the suburb of an English city. It is all dark, it rains all day long, it is foggy and smoky, the streets are dirty, the children are in rags. David Copperfield. When people see that, they react and say, the Industrial Revolution was awful. How good life was before the Industrial Revolution. The truth is just the opposite. Country life was extremely hard. People worked extremely hard from dawn till dusk, all day long, without a day off. And what for? To stay at mere subsistence level, where the slightest change in circumstances, like a livestock disease, a flood, or a meteorological phenomenon, could ruin everything, and mean the difference between life and death by starvation. Such was the very tough life in the country, the life people lived before the Industrial Revolution.
Queridos alumnos, de que esto era así. Es
And
que
the proof of this, dear students, is that once word got around,
pocos, y
at
entonces
first a few people emigrated, and then they started working in the factories.
que tú
Then word got around, and other people said, so, you have found a steady job in which you are paid regardless of the weather conditions? What luck! What a deal! And you say you also have a fixed schedule of 12 hours a day, instead of the 18 I work. How wonderful! And they give you half a day off on Sunday afternoons? What a great arrangement! How did you get this work? How could I get it?
y por comunicación de viva voz,
And when, by word of mouth, people found out, most of the agricultural workers left the countryside en masse
previamente agrícolas,
and moved to the city and its suburbs to try to get work as factory workers.
como trabajadores en las fábricas. Miren, esa
That is the acid test. Spontaneously, without being coerced by anyone, people left the countryside on a massive scale to go to work where the factories were. And from their point of view, according to all the historical studies, they improved their standard of living very considerably in doing so. It is just that, from a modern-day perspective, from the viewpoint of refined and generally affluent people with a high standard of living, the novels of Charles Dickens are moving and heart-wrenching. However, this does not detract a bit from the truth of what I am saying. There was a continuous improvement in the living standard, and it was illustrated by the very desires of farm workers, who realized that they benefited substantially if they went to work at the factories. Furthermore, the Industrial Revolution brought with it another very important development, the redirection of the entire production process toward, for the first time in history, the working classes. Until the Industrial Revolution, the few industrial artisans there were made luxury products for the very wealthy, for aristocrats, from carriages to those spectacular dresses we have all seen, embroidered with gold thread and beautifully trimmed, and high-heeled shoes. All of that changed radically. With capitalism, the entrepreneurs and the bourgeois realized that they needed to produce goods and services at very low prices precisely for the workers. I am going to ask you to do something now. Would those of you who are wearing jeans today please stand up? You, for example. Everyone who is wearing jeans. Let's see. Who is wearing jeans today? Look at that. Over half the class. Thank you very much. You may sit down. Do you know when jeans were invented? Jeans as an article of clothing were not invented by an entrepreneur to dress aristocrats and landowners. No, they were a brilliant idea, a comfortable and durable cotton garment which, due to economies of scale, could be produced in huge numbers by the thousands at a very low price, and made available to millions and millions of people who before had been dressed in rags. The garment was so successful that, as we have just seen here, over half of students are still coming to class in jeans today. Jeans are a typical example of a product of the Industrial Revolution in the area of textiles. The second cause Hayek cites for the myth is quite important. The survival of the myth up to the present day has been due not only to the mistaken comparison of living standards based on the current perspective rather than the historical one to determine whether they improved or deteriorated. The persistence of the myth and its total corruption are due also to a political struggle, specifically the political struggle that took place at the time of the Industrial Revolution. Two large parties were competing for power in the United Kingdom: the Conservative Tory Party and the Liberal Whig Party. The Liberal Party represented the thriving entrepreneurial bourgeoisie who were bringing about the capitalist industrial revolution. Meanwhile, the Tory Party represented the old aristocratic and landowning interests. Well, a sort of alliance formed between opposing forces. While the Industrial Revolution was in the process of beginning, a socialist revolutionary movement was also beginning, and its objective was to hinder, paralyze, criticize, and vilify the development of capitalism. And here, aristocrats and socialists became bedfellows. You see, dear students, aristocrats, landowners, and English noblemen were watching, terrified, as their dominance became increasingly threatened. They watched as their workers abandoned their land, the workers who, generation after generation, had lived in quasi-servitude, serving the landowning family. And now? Listen, we really care a lot about you, Lord whoever, but I am leaving to work on the outskirts of Manchester because the pay is higher. I will work less, and I will have more security. So landowners were aware that they were losing the workers on their land. The danger was the vigorous development of bourgeois capitalism. So they came up with a systematic plan to criticize the factory system. In large part, they were the ones who sponsored the creation of parliamentary committees to criticize the emerging factories, to try to reveal a supposed physical and moral deterioration of the children working in the mines. In any case, when they were working in the mines, that was a much better situation for them than the previous job they had been obliged to do, in the fields, in their own homes, in a state of quasi-servitude to the landowners. Though it may seem paradoxical, all of these committees established to attack capitalism were sponsored largely by the Tory or Conservative Party, which somehow agreed to collaborate, if only temporarily, with the socialist revolutionaries, who for other reasons and with other objectives also wished to do away with the capitalist system. The third cause Hayek mentions for the myth consists of all the undermining efforts of supposed intellectual progressives on the left, who systematically interpret events in a biased manner, and always to shed a negative light on the capitalist economic system. I'm not going to dwell on this any further. We discussed it the other day, when we talked about the very serious harm that has been done when a systematic attempt has been made to brainwash workers, thus embittering them and robbing them of joy in a job well done within the capitalist economic process, and trying to replace this with a sort of resentment which comes from being alienated or exploited by the owners of the company one works for. Why do intellectuals systematically hate capitalism? That is the question Bertrand de Jouvenel asks himself in the third and final article on the topic we are discussing here. This is a historical constant. As far back as ancient Greece, the most distinguished intellectuals, from Socrates to Plato, and even Aristotle himself, regarded with suspicion, if not outright hatred, anything that smacked of business, entrepreneurial, craft, or commercial activity. and these days you can count on it. For instance, most movie actors and actresses are completely against the market economy, not to mention the majority of the intellectuals who channel their creative efforts into writing literary works. They are also generally opposed to the market economy and capitalism. They are all against the market process. They are socialists. They are leftists. Why? Why is this so? This is something you need to be accustomed to and understand. In the future, when you enter the market and work at your companies, you are going to feel misunderstood on a daily basis, continually, by all cultured members of the so-called intelligentsia. They will all be against you. Why is this so? Asks Bertrand de Jouvenel. And he wrote a beautiful article explaining the reasons intellectuals, aside from some extremely honorable exceptions, generally tend to be opposed to the process of social cooperation embodied in the market. De Jouvenel cites basically the following three reasons. First, a lack of knowledge. In other words, a lack of theoretical knowledge of how market processes operate. According to Hayek, the entrepreneurial social order is the most complex order in the universe. It takes us 50 class sessions of in-depth analysis to even begin to scratch the surface. We make a daily effort to keep up with the readings, page after page, to even begin to see the light. Well, this deliberate analytical effort to grasp the workings of the spontaneous market process, knowledge which economic theory alone can provide, is unfortunately conspicuous by its absence in the minds of most intellectuals. Intellectuals are extremely self-important. Intellectuals think they have studied extensively, but most of them are totally ignorant about economic science. And that is the first reason Bertrand de Jouvenel cites. The second reason he mentions is the arrogance of the false rationalist, the arrogance of the intellectual. Intellectuals believe they know a good deal more than their fellow citizens, because they have received many degrees, or they are very refined people who have read a great number of books, or they attend a lot of social gatherings, or they compete for prizes. Intellectuals believe these things make them more intelligent than other people. They think themselves the brightest, and they very easily fall into the deadly sin of arrogance or pride, to the point that they believe themselves more entitled than we ourselves are to decide what we should do. Intellectuals laugh at the man on the street. Turning on the television offends their fine sensibilities. They find TV commercials nauseating. They are somehow horrified by everyone else's lack of culture, and from their pedestal they allow themselves to pontificate and to criticize what we are doing, because they believe they are smarter than the rest of us. And yet, as I have said, they know very little. They know very little about what goes on, and furthermore, they pose a potential danger. Inside of every intellectual, there is a potential dictator, and the moment he lets his guard down, he will fall into the temptation of wanting to assume political power to impose on everyone else his own particular viewpoints, which he believes are the best, the most refined, the most educated. If to ignorance the intellectual adds the fatal conceit of thinking he knows more than we do, that he is more cultivated and refined, then we are lost. And it should not surprise us that behind every great dictator in history, every Stalin, every Hitler, there have always been a cohort of fawning intellectuals who have attempted to provide him with a foundation of legitimacy from an ideological, cultural, or philosophical standpoint. There is also an important third reason, which Bertrand de Jouvenel is not afraid to bring to light. And, dear students, the third reason intellectuals are opposed to capitalism is quite simple. Take note. Resentment and envy. Resentment and envy. The intellectual is generally a deeply resentful person. Observe how well Bertrand de Jouvenel explains this. De Jouvenel realizes that the intellectual finds himself in a very uncomfortable position in the market. He perceives that, under most circumstances, the market value of what he contributes to the process of production is very slight. So, I have spent all these years studying. I have suffered greatly. I have moved to Paris. I do these monstrous paintings nobody buys. I am resentful. There is something rotten in capitalist society if it fails to properly value what I do. My supposed poems, my refined articles, or my novels. And in any case, even if I am lucky, even if I become fashionable, even if I become a Saramago, that is never enough. I am never paid enough, considering my worth as an intellectual, especially in comparison with the garbage I am surrounded with. And as an intellectual, what I cannot tolerate is to see some utterly ignorant, uncivilized, uncultured entrepreneur make 10 or 100 times what I make, simply by selling some ridiculous item, like chickens or boots or bathing suits, in the market to the masses and making a fortune. That is an unjust society, says the intellectual. We intellectuals are not paid what we are worth. And yet any Joe Blow makes 100 or 200 or 1,000 times as much as we do, just because he produces something the uneducated masses demand. Resentment and envy. We are human, dear students. If resentment and envy, which we must see behind the intellectual's attitude, are compounded by arrogance and ignorance, we must not be surprised that the cohort of men and women from the worlds of film and literature, etc., barring any possible exceptions, of course, invariably act in a biased manner against the entrepreneurial market process, which we are going to enter, are profoundly anti-capitalist, and regularly present themselves as the champions of socialism, progressivism, and redistribution. I believe we have talked enough about the labor factor of production, which is the most significant, because we will devote a large part of our lives to it, aside from whatever we devote as entrepreneurs or capitalists who save. Apart from labor, other productive factors are also important to the process of production, and our next topic deals with them, the non-human original factors of production. Basically, these consist of natural resources, what economists have traditionally referred to as the land factor. Again, this is a clumsy and mistaken expression. And the term labor factor is as well. I repeat, there are actually an almost infinite constellation of different types of labor factors, and also a very large constellation of different types of natural resources in general, and land factors in particular. Moreover, during certain stages in the evolution of economic science, mostly at the beginning, the land factor was considered the main factor. The very misguided Anglo-Saxon classical school, which emerged in an awkward, fumbling manner at the same time as the Industrial Revolution, was constructed around the land factor. It was viewed as the fundamental factor, the most important one. In fact, a French school called the Physiocrats built their entire scientific economic theory around land, the natural resource factor. During those years, economic scientists were obsessed with land rent, how land rent is determined, what land brings in. Tax systems were even created to levy taxes only on land rent. Henry George, for instance, was one of the best-known proponents of a reform of this sort. However, from today's perspective, it is clear that the land factor, like every other capital good, is just one more factor which contributes to the process of production, and that the rent of land, like the rent of every other factor, including the rent of the labor factor, which we call a wage, is determined by its discounted marginal value product. Some land is highly fertile because it is close to a river, or it is very well fertilized, or it is irrigated land. Thus, it is very productive, and it has a very high market value. Meanwhile, other land is useless. It is covered with brambles. No profit can be made from it. It has a very low value. From a historical perspective, we can see that there has actually been a change in the value of land. I remember, for instance, 30, 40, 50 years ago, after the Spanish Civil War, nobody set any value on a bunch of crags here in La Pedriza, a few kilometers from Madrid. Nothing could be grown there. It was no place to keep cattle. What a worthless spot. It was not good for anything. By the same token, no one valued land on the coast of Majorca. In Majorca, like in Catalonia, there existed, and there exists, the institution of the Heru. The eldest son inherited all of the good things, and the younger children received nothing but the worst, the worthless things. Well, at that time in the Balearic Islands, coastal land was worthless, because no one could live on the coast, since there was only useless sand there that could not be farmed. The eldest sons received property inland, which could be cultivated, and where a pig farm could be run, for example. However, tastes change. The standard of living rose in Spain, and people all began to want a second home, so that they could get out of the city. And go where? Well, we suddenly discovered the wonders of the mountains, the pure air, the oxygen, the hiking opportunities. And what in the past had produced nothing of market value, some crags nobody wanted, abruptly became very valuable. When tourism brought a change in circumstances in the 60s and 70s, second and third children, who had received the dregs of the inheritance, that is, the land on the coast, became millionaires. Suddenly, what we valued was taking off our clothes, covering ourselves with cream, and lying down on the beach to sunbathe. And when we felt really hot, going for a swim in the water. Who could have foreseen that 80 years ago? So you see that the world of entrepreneurship, civilization, the market process is dynamic and constantly changing. Tastes shift, and as a result, what at one time had no discounted marginal value product can become radically different. Still, there is plenty of land that has no market value because it is inland. Nothing can be grown on it, and it has no use. It acts as a game preserve where perhaps someone goes to hunt once in a while. Nevertheless, if hunting suddenly becomes fashionable, American and European millionaires might start visiting, to the point that it becomes worthwhile to build a landing strip inside the preserve. The millionaires can come, kill several thousand partridges, pay a fortune, and go home. A piece of land that was worthless begins to have value. In addition, land which is otherwise useless may have value simply because its owner swells up like a peacock at the very idea of being a landowner, and spends weekends strolling around on his property. So, any particular plot of land may be more or less profitable for any number of reasons. Still, our analysis is perfectly applicable. Some land is called submarginal land. What is submarginal land? According to Mises, it is land that has a discounted marginal value product of 0, and therefore no one values it, and it is abandoned. For example, 100 hectares of desert in the middle of the Sahara. If you go there, you will find nobody there, or in the middle of the Greenland ice sheet. By the way, Greenland got its name because in the Middle Ages there was a process of global warming, which was far more pronounced than the supposed current one. Everything melted, the land became a green zone, and cows grazed. There was no industrial revolution, and there were no problems related to greenhouse gases, the greenhouse effect, and so on. However, these days, no one places any value on a hectare in the middle of Antarctica, for instance, or a hectare of ocean surface in the middle of the Atlantic. All of that, which today has a discounted marginal value product of less than 0, is submarginal land that remains abandoned. And it should remain abandoned. It would be absurd to employ resources in an attempt to make use of it. The importance of economic theory, and this is an idea the great French economist Bastiat understood very clearly, lies in that it reveals not only what is plain and obvious, what is easily observable, but above all, consequences which are not immediate or short-term, the indirect, and thus not obvious or noticeable, medium or long-term consequences of all phenomena. Good economists are characterized by not only their attention to the seemingly obvious, but also their ability, through their reasoning and their knowledge of market processes, to anticipate inevitable medium and long-term effects. They focus not only on that which is seen, but also on what is most important, that which is not seen. So, if there is poverty and someone suggests, "Let us pass a minimum wage law," ignorant people all say, "Fantastic! A higher minimum wage. Why have we not thought of that before? We will double the minimum wage. Everyone who is hired will make twice as much. Why on earth has such a simple idea for escaping the poverty in the world not occurred to us before?" Of course, in India and China, where people are dying of hunger, only one thing is necessary: the establishment of a minimum wage for everyone. 3 times what people are earning now. That is the answer. Do-goodism, voluntarism. That is the solution to our problems. Nevertheless, this notion is utterly absurd. It rests solely on what is seen. We economic theorists respond, just a minute. In a market process, people tend to be paid the value of their contributions to the process of production, their discounted marginal value products. If you legally impose a wage higher than that, you are doing a disservice to precisely those you wish to favor. You are condemning them to unemployment, to a state of physical hunger. I am an economist, and the mission of an economist is to open the eyes of demagogues, politicians, the naive and the ignorant. That is why we economists are always swimming against the tide. That is why we are always seen by society as unpleasant, as those people who are constantly calling attention to medium and long-term effects and phenomena that are overlooked when political decisions are made, but are generally very harmful. I am referring to good economists, because there are also wicked economists, like John Maynard Keynes, a man we have already talked about, whose motto was, "In the long run, we are all dead." Why worry about the medium and long term if we are all going to be dead? All that matters is the short term and what is seen. But as you know, Keynes knew very little about economics. He studied it, and poorly, for only 6 months. He knew a lot less than you do. However, he palmed us off with a whole perverse book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, in which he justified all of the crackpot demagogic policies politicians had been insisting on pursuing. And for that reason, the book became fashionable. For the first time, someone who seemed respectable had given a veneer of scientific legitimacy to everything they had always wanted to do. But we talked about Keynes in another class, and we saw that his contributions lacked a scientific foundation, and he has done such serious harm to modern civilization that we have yet to fully recover. Thus it could be said that in the sphere of economic science, Keynes is the devil incarnate. I have told you that a good economist must open people's eyes to the effects which remain hidden, and appear only in the medium and long term, following the period of adjustment. A pseudo-economist who says, never focus on secondary effects, which appear in the medium and long term. Focus solely on what is directly observable. That is not an economist. That is the evil one himself, an enemy of society and an enemy of civilization. If the market process is to function, the economic agents who participate in it must gear their behavior toward compliance with the law. In other words, they must adopt a number of patterned behaviors which have emerged in an evolutionary manner and make life in society possible. Basically, these behaviors pertain to the definition and defense of property rights. For the market process to function, property rights must be well defined and effectively defended. Only when property rights are well defined and effectively defended is it certain that each participant in the production process will reap the benefits of his entrepreneurial creativity and also bear the costs of his actions. If property rights are not well defined, because the state, which supposedly should address the matter, does a poor job of it, and in fact it does do a poor job of it, or if property rights are not well defended, because though they are well defined on paper, in the laws, in practice you can very easily be robbed, swindled, fleeced without the state's defending you, or if both are true at once, property rights are neither well defined nor well defended. When such is the case, systematically irresponsible actions inevitably result. Many economic agents will then be able to afford to undertake actions that involve costs they do not meet themselves, but rather place on the shoulders of others, third parties who take no part in those actions. When property rights are not well defined, due to negligence or deliberate action, and in fact frequently government authorities say, "Oh, private property is the worst. Let us declare that beaches, continental shelves, rivers and air are public property." Here, property rights are deliberately not well defined. When not only are they not well defined, deliberately or otherwise, but they are also not properly defended, when these phenomena occur, what we will call externalities arise. Externalities can be of 2 types. Take note. we will begin by discussing what are known as negative externalities, or external costs. These arise when certain people fail to bear the entire cost of their decisions and actions in the market, and instead they burden the rest of the economic agents with a large part of those costs. When negative externalities occur, we say that too much is produced, since cost is not taken into account, property rights not being well defined. In other words, when an economic agent does not consider all of the costs incurred in the production process, he produces a volume of output that exceeds the amount he should produce. One example of a negative externality would be air pollution. Imagine I own a car factory, and as a result of the manufacturing process, polluted smoke is released. The air carries the smoke, and it harms many third parties. However, I do not pay anything to offset the cost I am creating for other people. In this situation, I am producing too many cars. If I had to take that cost into account, my volume of output would be smaller. That is why it is said that when negative externalities are present, too much is produced. We could talk about a river. When a river is declared public, everyone pollutes it. Perhaps there is a factory, a paper mill. All of the cellulose waste is thrown into the river, and what happens to the river? It becomes filthy. The fish die. There is garbage everywhere, etc. If I had to pay to clean the river, to install a purification system, etc., I would produce less. Are negative externalities the fault of the market? Dear students, quite the opposite is true. Negative externalities arise when the market and its logic are not permitted to spread to all natural resources. Negative externalities are not the fault of the market, but of state intervention, which prevents the adequate definition of property rights, their defense, or both, due to either negligence or deliberate action.
No es culpa del mercado, sino...
Dear students, when the Industrial Revolution began, general legal principles were applied in England through common law. And on many occasions, when a factory was polluting the air or a river, or a train sped through, sent out a spark, and set a neighbouring farmer's field on fire, those who felt harmed would file a claim with the corresponding judge to request compensation for damages. Do you know that it was deliberate action by the government, often on the pretext of encouraging or stimulating development, which legally prevented these claims from being successful? That is to say, such action prevented the correct definition and the defense of property rights. And what began implicitly has become commonplace nowadays, when pompous UN declarations state that the sea is by no means going to be privatized. That is unheard of. Or the beaches, or the rivers. Nevertheless, where do pollution problems exist? Do we have pollution problems in our homes? Can you even imagine, ding dong, our doorbell ringing, and when we open the door, our neighbour is standing there with a garbage can, and she dumps her garbage, all of her disgusting trash, in our house? No. Unless people are slobs, which cannot be ruled out, private homes are clean on the inside. But what about common areas? This reminds me of an old Spanish proverb. Do you know what it says? Take note. What belongs to everyone belongs to no one. What belongs to everyone belongs to no one. If everybody owns something, nobody owns it. How true that is. The common areas of a building are usually in disrepair, and the common areas of a park are usually dirty, as are shared rivers. This is due to the problem of what is known as the tragedy of the commons. If I am drinking a Coke and I throw the can on the ground, I internalize all of the benefit of not having to carry around pesky trash in my pocket all afternoon. I toss the can on the ground, and since I am leaving, I do not have to look at it. I leave the cost of the garbage distributed among the tens or hundreds of other visitors who may walk through the park after I do. The result? When a good is declared a public good, it is destroyed, spoiled, degraded, and contaminated. That is why the beaches are dirty, and that is why the air is polluted. Do you know how government authorities respond to pollution? By criticizing the market economy, those wicked entrepreneurs, and doing everything but what they should do. Instead of privatizing the resource, instead of privatizing the air, instead of privatizing the sea, instead of privatizing the rivers, instead of privatizing the mountains, instead of privatizing the beaches, authorities issue thousands and thousands of pages of regulations on what must be done. I want you to go to the bookstore and ask for the Environmental Code. It is insane. Socialism, plain and simple. If you want a river to be clean and full of fish, privatize it. All of the rivers in England are clean, and they are all private. They have private owners or communities of owners. No one pollutes a river there. Someone would immediately file a complaint, and a fine would be charged. There are high-end, low-end, and mid-range fishing clubs, and they are all clean. In the same way, we have restaurants from Zalakane to McDonald's, fast food. Do not think that if beaches are private, you will not be able to go to them. There will be beaches for everyone, a very wide offering of all kinds of beaches, and natural parks, etc. So, the solution to negative externalities is the privatization of resources. Capitalism, the market economy, spreading the logic of entrepreneurship and property rights to all the resources which at present have been declared publicly owned. Let us wrap up the class by talking about the other externalities. To tell you the truth, market criticism is curious. Not only is the market criticized for the external costs that arise when too much is produced, like when pollution occurs, but the market is also criticized for being too successful. People find fault with the market when external benefits or positive externalities appear. Positive externalities appear when an entrepreneurial action benefits not only those directly involved in it, but also many other people who, it is pointed out, benefit from the action without paying for it. These people are called free riders. Again, the market is criticized. Listen, capitalism does not work because many actions serve not only those involved, but numerous other people as well. Response? So what? What is wrong with that? Every entrepreneurial action does in fact benefit many people besides those directly involved. No, that is unfair, and furthermore, it is inefficient. Those people do not pay, and therefore you are not taking into account the service you are providing them with, and you are producing too little. Where negative externalities, external costs, exist, it is said that too much is produced, and in the case of external benefits, it is said that too little is produced. You are not producing enough. To give you an idea, education is a clear example. If I get an education, and I pay for my education, I am benefiting, because I am becoming a more learned person. I am going to earn a higher wage, etc. But some say, your getting an education is not advantageous to you alone. It will also offer advantages to many other people you come into contact with. What does this mean? It means you are not spending enough on education. Therefore, Papa State has to come in and invest more in education. An entire theory of public goods has been developed. Its proponents theorize that whenever non-excludability exists, that is, whenever other people cannot be excluded from consumption, and there is non-rivalry in consumption, in short, whenever the free rider phenomenon occurs, there is a public good. And they mention a lighthouse as a typical example of a public good. Lighthouses give out light. A lighthouse shines light and reveals the location of all boats, and anyone who passes by can see the light, whether or not he has paid for it. Such theorists say, a lighthouse is an example of a public good. Many people benefit from it without paying anything. So obviously, no one is going to want to pay to build a lighthouse system, because there will be no way of excluding free riders and charging them. Therefore, a lighthouse is a public good. The state must provide it. Education is a public good. The state must provide it. Defense is also a public good, and the state must provide it. If I build a nuclear umbrella, like the one Reagan created, we will all benefit from the umbrella, those who have paid and those who have not. It is then argued, free riders will not want to pay for a nuclear umbrella defense system, and it will not be built. Therefore the state must step in. Is this a sound or a plausible argument? No, it is not, dear students. Dynamically speaking, every apparently non-excludable and non-rivalrous public good creates incentives for people to find creative, entrepreneurial solutions for excluding non-payers. Such solutions may involve legal or technical innovations, etc. There is a classic article titled The Lighthouse in Economics, which was written by Ronald Coase, a winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics. I am not generally a fan of his, but in this particular article I am. Coase shows that the entire lighthouse system in the United Kingdom was privately financed, because in an environment of freedom, ways were found to exclude free riders, through ship owners and fishermen's associations, and even the most obvious methods. Listen, England is a very boring country. It rains all day, and the only fun thing to do is to go to a pub and drink warm beer. Well, the mere threat of all your companions giving you the cold shoulder in the pub was enough to make you pay your fee to finance the lighthouse system. And the entire lighthouse system in the United Kingdom was private. Moreover, in an environment of freedom, technological innovations occur, such as GPS positioning systems and D-scramblers. People used to say television is a public good. What nonsense! What a ridiculous notion! Think of Canal Plus, Via Digital, and other cable TV channels. The company installs a little device in your house, you pay a fee, and others are excluded, as long as there is a political interest in it. And what about education? There is a huge joke in all of this. Some say, theoretically, in static terms, education is a public good, because it is non-excludable, and free riders benefit. Therefore, the state must intervene. How? How much? And how would we know if the state were intervening too much and spending inefficiently? Take a look at these classrooms in a public, state-owned university. 30% of students never come to class. Why? It does not matter to them. The opportunity cost is zero. Enrollment costs next to nothing. All education should be private, from the time children are small, as soon as they begin to have the use of reason, until they are adults. The public goods argument provides no justification for public education. Now we come to the definitive argument. And what about defense? Clearly defense is a public good, because otherwise, if we set up an anti-missile system... To hear this in Spain, where we kept the Roman legions in check for nearly 100 years with guerrilla warfare, we Spanish people discovered guerrilla warfare, private warfare, and defense poses no problem. Look at countries like Switzerland. Practically all of the Swiss have a gun at home, and at the first sign of trouble, everyone is ready, and no one is getting in. Hitler never dared to set foot in Switzerland. So the static phenomena of non-rivalry in consumption and non-excludability of free riders, when viewed from a dynamic perspective, give rise to incentives to discover the innovations necessary to make exclusion possible. Therefore, in dynamic terms, the set of public goods tends to be empty, and there is no scientific justification for the existence of the state.